They walked into the darkness like archaeologists stepping into a tomb. In the half-collapsed tunnels and factories of northern Germany, Allied soldiers brushed soot from metal and found machines that did not belong to the time they knew. Sleek, blackened cylinders, fin-stubbed and still warm with the memory of combustion. Up close, they were almost beautiful. Painted steel skins scored by shrapnel, rivets like teeth, bellows and pipes that led into the throat of something vast. There was no siren, there was no whistle. The terror these missiles inflicted had arrived faster than sound itself. For the Americans who first examined these fragments, the feeling was immediate and unsettling. This was not merely a better bomb or a clever airplane. It was a different category of weapon. It seemed to come from the future. The rocket that produced that future was the V-2, the Vergeltungswaffe 2, the retribution weapon of Nazi Germany. To the British and Americans who tracked parts of it back to Peenemünde and the subterranean production lines at Mittelwerk near Nordhausen, the V-2 was both a technical leap and a moral thicket. It was a missile that roared out of the sky faster than anyone below could hear. It carried a 1-ton warhead on a ballistic arc that briefly pierced the edge of the atmosphere, and it was built at a terrible human cost. The Americans were left in a state that mixed awe, embarrassment, fear, and an urgent hunger to understand. Imagine the machine in practical terms. Standing roughly 45 feet tall, about the height of a 4-story building, the V-2 was powered by a liquid fuel rocket engine that burned a mixture of alcohol and liquid oxygen. At sea level, it produced on the order of tens of thousands of pounds of thrust, enough impulse to lift the weight of a small house in a few seconds. Guidance was achieved not by radio control or simple gyros alone, but by a suite of gyroscopes and rudimentary analog computing that adjusted vanes in the airflow and actuated steering nozzles. Once launched, the V-2 followed a parabolic ballistic trajectory, fast up beyond much of the atmosphere, and then down again, re-entering supersonically. To civilians below, it was terrifying because it arrived without warning, no engine sound to give notice until a shock and destruction had already occurred. Numbers help frame the scale. Historians estimate roughly 3,000 V-2s were fired during the war, concentrated on cities like London and Antwerp, where they killed and maimed thousands and demolished whole neighborhoods. The rocket did not always land on its intended target. Weather, production defects, guidance errors produced randomness, but its psychological impact was profound. It was not merely the physical devastation, it was the realization that a nation could build a weapon that struck from above with little warning and seemed to mock existing air defenses. But the V-2 story does not end with the terror it unleashed.
When Allied forces overran research stations and underground factories in 1945, they found more than ruined warheads and launch pads. They found intact hardware, detailed engineering drawings, test stands, and men, engineers and technicians who had spent a decade pushing the boundaries of rocket design. The United States and Britain had to answer a cold strategic question. Let this intelligence fall into Soviet hands, or seize it and use it to bolster their own future. That choice, part ethical dilemma, part raw geopolitical competition, set in motion a sequence of operations and decisions that would reshape post-war technology. Two of the most consequential operations, Operation Lusty and Operation Paperclip, embodied this duality. Operation Lusty was primarily an effort by the Allied intelligence to collect aircraft and aeronautical materials before they could be destroyed or captured by the Soviets. Teams hunted through factories and test stands, creating engines, instruments, and documents for shipment to England and the United States. Operation Paperclip was the program through which the U.S. Army and other American agencies recruited and, in many cases, quietly transported German scientists and engineers to America. The men who had worked at Peenemünde, Werner von Braun among them, became prime targets. To some U.S. officers, the technical knowledge these men possessed outweighed the moral stains of their war service. To others, the idea of bringing former Nazi collaborators into American labs was deeply troubling. The rush was palpable. Trains packed with rockets and paperwork moved toward Western ports. Crates were stamped and restamped. By late 1945 and into 1946, German V-2 components were being shipped across the Atlantic to the United States, directed to laboratories and proving grounds whose names would become part of the emerging American rocketry story: Fort Bliss, White Sands Proving Ground, and later Redstone Arsenal. White Sands, in the wide white salt desert of New Mexico, became the theater of what was in many respects the first public encounter between American engineers and full-scale V-2 hardware. The scene at White Sands was a strange mix of battlefield salvage and laboratory precision. Crated components arrived bearing German stenciled numbers and inspection marks, then had to be inventoried, reverse-engineered, and reassembled. There were thousands of tiny parts, valves, seals, hoses, that for American technicians read like a foreign language. The V-2's engine required careful handling of liquid oxygen, an oxidizer that demands respect. Fuel lines and pumps had been designed under a different manufacturing logic than American ordnance crews normally expected. Many systems that looked straightforward on a schematic were brittle in practice. The first full-scale reconstructed V-2 launch on American soil was not a smooth demonstration of mastery. It was April 16, 1946, and it was full of tension.
Men in wool coats and goggles stood in the New Mexican cold and watched as a machine, assembled from captured parts and new replacements, thundered to life. The engine ignited with a sound that rearranged the desert's silence, fire and smoke and a plume that stretched into the sky. The rocket climbed, and then, by the accounts of those present, it broke apart, structural stresses and mismatched parts doing what improvisation sometimes produces. Yet even when it failed, the launch proved a point that no schematic could. Rocket flight at this scale could be achieved with the principles the Germans had developed. Telemetry equipment, hastily adapted, began to produce data, pressure curves, engine performance, guidance traces. With each test, engineers learned how to interpret the language of rocket flight. Those telemetry readings were humbling. American rocketry pioneers like Robert H. Goddard had rustled through experiments with liquid propulsion and had made crucial early contributions. But the V-2 represented years of concentrated, funded effort toward an operational ballistic weapon. That the Germans had achieved a working, repeatable long-range rocket provoked both admiration and a measure of professional embarrassment among Allied engineers. One veteran scientist later reflected on how the V-2's existence laid bare a gap in priorities and scale. The United States had pursued a scattered set of experiments. Germany had poured resources into a program with different strategic impetus. The physical repairs and the technical data were only the beginning. Behind the engines and the schematics lay a moral cost that could not be detached from the machines. The Mittelwerk facility near Nordhausen produced the bulk of V-2s using labor from the nearby Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp. Prisoners toiled in subterranean workshops under brutal conditions. Thousands died from disease, starvation, exposure, and execution. When American investigators sifted through production records and testimony, the link between technological achievement and human suffering was stark. Any description of the V-2 that isolates it as an engineering marvel alone misses the full horror of how it was produced. The rocket's black cylinders carried not only explosives, but the shadows of those who were forced to make them. Operationally, once V-2s and their plans were in U.S. custody, they became a kind of curriculum. Recovery teams cataloged parts and photographs, engineers reconstructed engines and guidance systems, and technicians drew lessons that would carry forward. A succession of test programs bridged the captured technology to indigenous American development. Early experiments like the Whack Corporal and the Bumper series, where a small sounding racket rode atop a V-2 booster, served as practical laboratories. The Bumper Whack launches demonstrated how stacking stages could push payloads higher and provided an apprenticeship in upper atmosphere flight.
V-2 components were modified and improved, guidance algorithms were refined, materials were strengthened, fuel handling became safer. Personnel decisions mattered as much as hardware. Many German scientists were offered positions at Fort Bliss, Texas, and later at Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama. The mathematician engineers who had worked under the Third Reich now found themselves in American uniforms or working for U.S. contracts, teaching American crews how to interpret gyroscopic error, how to balance two fluid pumps, how to troubleshoot turbopumps. Figures such as Major General Holger Toftoy of the U.S. Army Ordnance Corps played important roles in shepherding the captured scientists into American programs, balancing questions of security, utility, and moral cost. The infusion of knowledge accelerated projects that might otherwise have taken years longer. But the V-2 was not a singular magical key that opened the American door to space. It was a powerful seed and a harsh teacher. The United States already had pockets of rocket research and a distributed community of experimenters. The captured hardware and personnel accelerated certain timelines and introduced a level of practical systems engineering that counted for a great deal. Yet the expansion from weapon to complex space vehicles depended on broader institutional capacity, industrial production, funding, political will, and decades of organizational learning. The V-2 shortened parts of that path. It did not create the entire road. Even as Americans worked to digest and improve upon what they had taken from Germany, the Soviets were doing the same. Soviet teams captured hardware and German engineers in the eastern zones, and a contest quietly unfolded across a map of Europe and the United States. This geopolitical shadow play would explode into open political crisis in 1957. That autumn, the world heard the steady beeping of a small satellite, Sputnik, launched by the Soviet Union on October 4, 1957. The orbiting sphere and its radio ping were more than a technological milestone, they were a political blow. For Americans who had spent a decade absorbing German rocket knowledge and fitting it into their own programs, Sputnik was a moment of acute national humiliation and urgency. The calculus of security shifted from cautious development to frantic national priority. Government budgets changed, scientific communities were mobilized. Space, once a speculative field, became a theater of urgent public policy. The counterpunch came quickly. On January 31, 1958, the United States launched Explorer-1 atop a Juno 1 rocket. It was a utilitarian design that drew on many threats: Army ordnance developments, von Braun's team at Redstone Arsenal, and the incremental lessons of the post-war test programs. When Explorer-1 reached orbit, the emotional payoff for many Americans was profound.
After months of crisis and public anxiety, a small cylindrical probe carrying scientific instruments had become the first American satellite. Scientists quickly analyzed its telemetry and discovered the Van Allen radiation belts, an unexpected scientific windfall that underlined the new era's potential for discovery as well as competition. From those early rockets to the towering Saturn V that would later carry astronauts to the moon, the lineage is one of influence, iteration, and scale. The Redstone family of rockets, the Atlas, and later the multi-stage Saturn vehicles inherited principles that had been sharpened by the V-2 era: staging, liquid propulsion, guidance and control, structural design. But the Saturn V was also the fruit of enormous industrial capacity, decades of engineering innovation, and political commitment on a scale that transcended any single antecedent. The V-2 mattered. It taught lessons, provided hardware to be studied, and brought people together under urgent projects. But it was not the sole architect of Apollo. It was among several important strands woven into a larger tapestry. Yet any recounting of technological lineage must return to the human ledger. Those who turned German knowledge into American capability also made conscious moral choices. The U.S. decision to recruit and employ former Nazi scientists, some of whom had been complicit in war crimes, directly or indirectly, was driven by Cold War imperatives and the fear of Soviet advantage. The moral compromises were real, rewarding skill set against accountability for past conduct, prioritizing national security over a fuller reckoning. At the same time, scores of victims of the Nazi labor system were not given a place in the narrative of technical progress. Their suffering should not be footnote or background. It is interwoven with the hardware and must be remembered. The scene of a White Sands launch and the scene of forced labor at Middlework sit in stark contrast: the desert of technical spectacle and the tunnels of human degradation. Those contrasts are part of the V-2's enduring lesson. Technological innovation can be both a tool of destruction and a foundation for discovery. The V-2's engineers drew upon the mathematics of flight, thermodynamics, and material science, and turned them into a weapon. Those same principles, in different hands and under different circumstances, would lift scientific instruments and humans toward new horizons. There were moments during the White Sands tests and in later launches when the visuals captured the story's paradox. Rockets assembled from captured parts left the desert with an unforgettable violence of sound and flame, and within a few years, successors inspired imagineering and wonder that fed a public appetite for exploration. The men and women who monitored the telemetry at the consoles, some who had been soldiers, others who had been technicians, remembered both the technical lesson and the moral unease.
They spoke of being humbled by the German accomplishments, of scrambling to catch up, and of an acute awareness that they were building on knowledge gained from a regime that had wrought enormous harm. The public arc from V-2 terror to Apollo triumph collapsed a complicated moral narrative into an arguably tidy tale. Weapons to wonders, defeat to triumph. The truth is naughty. The V-2 accelerated knowledge and gave American programs a running start, but it also carried with it the history of its making. Von Braun and his colleagues became engineers in a new national project. Some of them expressed genuine enthusiasm for science and exploration, even as their wartime affiliations remained a dark stain. Policies that brought scientific talent to America also delayed public scrutiny and the ethical accounting many felt was owed. Technically, the V-2's contributions can be summarized without diminishing their complexity. Liquid propulsion at scale, practical solutions to turbopump and injector design, the use of gyroscopic guidance for stable ascent, and an operational approach to mass production of rockets were all immediate and tangible lessons. Engineering culture changed. Systems engineering, testing protocols, and a greater emphasis on integrated telemetry and instrumentation found new urgency. The Bumper series and other experimental programs converted the ballistic missile concept into tools for high-altitude research. These experiments trained generations of American engineers, technicians, and managers for what was to come. The Cold War context amplified every decision. The Soviet Union's own adoption and evolution of German technology led to their early space successes. In turn, American responses moved from salvage and analysis to an orchestrated national effort that of course included political theater, budget battles, and competitive urgency. Sputnik's beeping had been a psychological shock, but the response it elicited reshaped funding for science, education, and defense. And yet the practical threads that connected 1940s V-2s to 1969 Saturn V were not simply technical novelties passed intact from one program to the next. They were lessons translated into new materials, new manufacturing methods, and, perhaps most importantly, new organizational capabilities. The ability to coordinate industries, universities, and military resources at an unprecedented scale. The Saturn V was, in many senses, the moral and industrial project of a nation choosing to commit enormous resources to a symbolic and scientific goal. In the end, how did the V-2 leave Americans in complete shock? The shock had multiple faces. There was the immediate professional astonishment, the recognition that an enemy had achieved working long-range rocketry in ways that publicly documented Allied programs had not. There was the emotional recoil at the human cost, the forced labor and deaths tied directly to production.
There was political unease as planners calculated whether to welcome German scientists into American projects. And there was the public chagrin that came years later with Sputnik, a belated confirmation that the age of rockets had arrived and that the world would be different. So the V-2 remains a complicated landmark, a weapon that terrorized European cities, and at the same time, a technical teacher that accelerated mid-century advances in rocketry. It was both a product of focused engineering and a stain on moral history. It helped create a technical vocabulary that American engineers could adopt and expand, but it did not write the whole story of American spaceflight on its own. Rather, it was part of a mosaic, one tile that, once picked up from the ruins, changed how a nation imagined its future. The arc from soot-blackened cylinders in a European tunnel to the white conical stacks upon which astronauts sat decades later is one of transformation and tension. It is a story of how knowledge crosses borders, sometimes in crates, sometimes in people, and how that crossing forces nations to ask what they are willing to trade for security and progress. By the time that a Saturn V thundered from Cape Kennedy with a crew bound for the moon, the United States had woven lessons from the V-2 era into an engineering and institutional fabric far broader than any single borrowed rocket. The moon landing stands as both an astonishing human achievement and a reminder that some of the knowledge that helped make it possible originated in a shadowed corner of history. If this story has grabbed your attention and you want more deep dives into the untold origins of spaceflight, subscribe now. History does not forgive easy narratives. When we look back, we must hold two images together: the steel and fire that transformed how nations fought and reached skyward, and the faces of those who suffered in the factories that made that transformation possible. Remembering layered history is not an attempt to punish innovation. It is an attempt to keep memory honest while acknowledging the dual nature of technology. The V-2 taught engineers how to build bigger engines and how to stage rockets.
It also taught a political class that missile technology could radically alter global power. It taught the public a new vocabulary of fear and awe. It taught a generation of managers and planners that industrial-scale rocketry required not only brilliant ideas, but deep coordination between military, industry, and the scientific community. And for the men and women standing on the White Sands Desert in April 1946, watching a captured design shake itself apart, and then in later tests climbed cleanly into high altitudes, the lesson was visceral. The future had arrived, and it carried both promise and peril. Some of the same hands that learned those lessons built the vehicles that placed the first American instruments into orbit, and later the hardware that took humans beyond Earth.
The story's final frame leads to Apollo, a crowded achievement drawing from many tributaries. The V-2's technical genetics are there, in principle and practice. But the path from weapon to wonder ran through decades of institutional learning, policy decisions, and ethical compromises. The moon landing was the payoff of an enormous chain of events, and the V-2 was one of the first links. Knowing that link forces us to see both the engineering lineage and the human cost that made it possible. If you want to explore more about Operation Paperclip, the ethical history of Cold War science, and how nations stitch together talent in uneasy times, watch the next video. We examine in detail how those difficult choices shaped the scientists, the programs, and the policy debates that defined a generation.